Is the democratic oversight Terminator finally dead? And Brisbane is now a great big nuclear target. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 12th of September 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we are going to give you an update on this really dramatic saga involving our fight to stop these sellouts in Canberra destroying democratic oversight over the most powerful power in the country, i.e. the money power that the RBA wields. So we're very, 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 very close to declaring victory, Craig.
Yes.
Very, very close. So very important update there, plus more on the postal bank. And we're going to talk very disturbingly in the Australia Must Have an Independent Foreign Policy files about what is the latest news, that if you live in Brisbane, there are countries in the world that have just marked a circle around your city and they're prepared to blow you to smithereens because you've become a nuclear target, and we'll tell you why. And we're not doing it to damage your property prices, but...
although that will have the effect.
That will have the effect. Okay, remember before we get into it, this is not just information, we're providing ammunition for you to help change what we're talking about. We do it, we're not commentators, we're trying to change this. And you can help, with this show. We cover the important subjects on our show. You can help us by helping getting it around. Like the show. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe and ring the bell icon so that you're always informed of updates. And we've got an update this week as an example of a senator's speech, but we're going to play that in the show as well. Make comments below. The feedback we appreciate from the comments, and I try and respond to them as much as I can. And also, there's a donate button below where you can help fund what we do. And in this case, we're always doing things.
Well, you just come back from Canberra this week after spending 3 days up there, and I'm heading off to Canberra in 2 weeks' time. And then this weekend we're off to Adelaide, to our forum in Adelaide, which will be happening this Sunday. And then we have another one down in Hobart on the 5th of October. It's a new one. We put that together to have one in Hobart because we had a very successful forum in Launceston. The first one we've actually had first meeting we've had in Launceston for over 20 years. Wow. And we had a large number of people come to that event. It was very successful because people heard, the strategic update, what's happening in the world. They heard from Nolene, my wife, on the subject of Shake Your Chains, which is after there's a line in the very famous Percy B. Shelley poem, Mask of Anarchy. They've heard from you, strategic updates, and then they heard from me the history of the party, which hasn't been presented anywhere else except at these forums. So that's happening this Sunday in Adelaide. It's still not too late to register, although I'm sure might have to put more water in the soup.
That's right.
But also the Hobart, and these things cost us money. This will make 13 forums that we've been around the country on, Robbie. So
these are this is the logistics that require logistics in depth. It requires financial support to do it. But Craig, we're now about to go through the other reason that it's what we do. It's the reason we do these things. We're actually there's lots of examples of late where we've had a direct impact on the shaping of policy in Australia in a way that we really want people to understand is possible, but you've got to be informed and you've got to be focused. You can't just stamp your feet at something you don't like and say, I don't like that, and when the universe doesn't change because you stamp your feet, then convince yourself there's nothing you can do to change it.
And you've been working very closely with the senators up there to help directly shape what takes place in the parliament.
But the reason they talk to me is because they know that I'm backed up by the Citizens Party, the viewers of this show who are prepared to activate. That's why they take the Citizens Party seriously. We're getting citizens engaged in the political process. So let's give you the update on that now. Is the democratic oversight Terminator finally dead? And Mr. Producer, please put an image on the screen of the democratic oversight Terminator. And I want to be very careful here. I want people to understand this looks like to you the Treasurer of Australia, Jim Chalmers. This is the Terminator of democratic oversight in Australia, Jim Chalmers. We are not calling for Jim Chalmers to be finally dead, but this particular manifestation of him politically as someone who just as the Terminator was sent from the future with one mission, Craig, and that mission was to kill John Connors, I think his name was, right? He's that one, and remember, absolute focus on that one mission. Well, we're calling Jim Chalmers the Terminator of democratic oversight because on this question of reforming the Reserve Bank, he has been, in the last 2 weeks, so obsessed with making it impossible for an elected government to use a power that has never been used in 79 years it's been on the books. But he's been so obsessed with doing that, he is like the Terminator with this single-minded focus. And of course, we, the Citizens Party, led the fight to stop him from doing that.
And we don't know why. I mean, we can speculate, but there's no...
Well, we know why we led the fight. We don't know why he's so obsessed.
That's right. We just don't know why he's so obsessed with this, given that just what you just said then.
We understand that there's a broader question that we're very familiar with, which is the Bank for International Settlements is this global apparatus that governs, through which all the world's central banks coordinate what they do. And it has been on a jihad for the last couple of decades to get rid of any possibility of elected governments being able to interfere with the actions of unelected technocrats running central banks.
Which we exposed in 2013 as wanting to bring bail-in into this country. Now, this is all being done very secretively. They do this through these back doors in these central banks. But the intention was to bring in bail-in. We caught them at it in 2013. Bail-in, of course, is the process by which the banks can offset their losses by stealing people's deposits, in effect. And it's happened in Cyprus in 2013, and it really did rattle a lot of cages when the banks were seen to actually do this.
And they came up with this as a way to keep the banks propped up in another crisis. This was all devised in the wake of the global financial crisis. But when they came up with this policy, they realised pretty quickly they had a problem, because if elected governments were able to have any say over a bail-in and they wanted to get re-elected, they realised pretty quickly an elected government would be very unwilling to literally confiscate the deposits of the people who have to vote for them. Yeah. So that's when they said, okay, we've got to take this out of the hands of elected governments. And they called it political interference. And too many people fall for that kind of spin. Because you hear someone say, oh, you don't want political interference. People, stuff the way they use their language, they're lying to you. They use words like political interference, they're meaning democratic accountability. They're meaning they want to get rid of your ability as a citizen of Australia to influence the big decisions that affect your life. That's what they want to get rid of. And they call it political interference. And they craft these terms like that. Bail-in was the example, and the other one is what central banks do. Now, the reason there's a debate in Australia is because in late 2021, the previous governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Philip Lowe, may as well have said to every young family in Australia, run out and get yourself hocked up to the eyeballs in debt to buy a house you can't afford, because these 0.1% interest rates will stay that way forever. That's what he may as well have said. And if you're one of the people who have been absolutely crushed in the subsequent 3 years because that wasn't true, what he said, and they have racked up interest rates at the fastest rate in history and have absolutely crushed people, if you're one of those people, you should be pretty mad at the Reserve Bank for doing it. But reserve banks and bankers have this tendency, they always have had this tendency, Craig. And so, 80 years ago, the great Australian Labor Party, led by the greatest of our political leaders, John Curtin and Ben Chifley, enacted a power that said, if these damn central bankers become overbearing bastards and are just, ratcheting down the pain on people so they can meet some stupid target for inflation, and they don't care how many people they crush, the government must have the ability to intervene and say, no, we represent the people, you're not going to do that, we're going to overrule your decision. And they legislated that in 1945. Now, a banker's stooge named Robert Menzies took over in 1949. But even he saw that, you're talking about the sovereignty of Parliament here over the financial system. So when he created the Reserve Bank, he kept that power in 1959. And so it's been there for 79 years, like I said. And this Terminator, this snotty-nosed punk compared to these great giants of our history, Jim Chalmers, by the way, Dr. Jim Chalmers. Doctorate of what? Not a doctor of medicine.
No.
He's one of these academic doctors. And Craig, I have to say it, too many of these academic doctors, maybe if you've got 3 doctorates, you should call yourself doctor. But I know the real giants of science, etc., who have these doctorates, they don't demand people call them doctor.
I think his thesis was on studying Paul Keating, ironically.
He's not even an economist. He has a
PhD.
He has a PhD in political science studying Paul Keating.
Yeah, that's right.
But Dr. Jim Chalmers, he's what you call a wanker. That's the Australian term for this guy. He's a wanker, right? He thinks that he is the superior mind who knows better than every other person in the last 80 years about this power, and he's going to get rid of it. Because, of course, what he's not telling people the truth is that he's following the dictates of the Bank for International Settlements. So, there's been real drama. Elisa and Richard covered the debate, so the technical side of the debate. But I just wanted to I want to give people the actual politics of it now, because I was up there in Canberra for Monday and Tuesday this week, and I was having lots of discussions about this. And it was starting to become really obvious that Jim Chalmers wasn't going to let this go. Mm-hmm. He really wanted this. So what he did is he gave a press conference on Tuesday in the Blue Room. Now, the Blue Room is where the government of the day gives press conferences to announce a new policy. So this was an unusual use of the Blue Room, because he gave the press conference to just dump all over Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, by basically saying, where, I had a deal with Angus Taylor, and he's been rolled by his party. That's what Jim Chalmers said. Angus Taylor has been rolled by his party. He broke the deal. Well, the truth is, yes, the party backed away from this policy because the party was rolled by the Citizens Party. I'm very careful about not taking credit for things that we haven't done. But I tell you what, when we have done it, we will take credit for it. We did this. The Citizens Party did this. Last year, 2023, when Jim Chalmers' RBA review was handed down, recommending getting rid of Section 11 that has this government veto over the interest rate decisions, Angus Taylor was all for it. Of course they had a deal. Jim Chalmers is right to have his nose put out of joint. Of course they had a deal. But we swung into action. We made a video called The Great Betrayal. We got everyone to call members of Parliament, especially Liberals, and say, don't you do this. We explained the history of what I just touched on with Ben Chifley and John Curtin, etc. We demanded an inquiry, and the calls, thanks to viewers of our show, were so fierce on the Parliament. One of the one senator's staffer said to another senator's staffer who passed it on to me, he said, there's no one like the Citizens Party to melt the phones down. So the Liberal Party decided, okay, we better support an inquiry. That was when Jim Chalmers first realised that the deal he thought he had with Angus Taylor was looking shaky, and he complained about that last year. But then once we got the inquiry, sort of like all the rest of it took care of itself, because out of the woodwork came a number of former treasurers and a number of former Reserve Bank governors. And the former treasurers were Paul Keating and Peter Costello, and the former Reserve Bank governors were Bernie Fraser and Ian McFarlane. People who had real world experience knowing this power, what it was for, in terms of the relationship between the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank. And they all said, keep it. You should not be getting rid of this power. We need this power. They all said that. And so it was literally Jim Chalmers was the only guy out on a limb. Anyway, so he then came back with this idea 2 weeks ago where he wrote to Angus Taylor and said, okay, we'll keep the power, but I want to put a public interest restriction on it so it can only be used in extreme circumstances. And then he sends out an amendment. He circulates amendments this week that have that language. The power must only be used in extreme circumstances and only in the public interest. But he didn't even define, when you write legislation, you've got to be very careful that you define all your terms.
What's an extreme circumstance?
No definition at all. No. What is an extreme circumstance? And the people I was talking to said, look, this is just an unserious, that's the word they use, unserious, desperate attempt to try and get some kind of a deal with Angus Taylor, driven by his obsession, the one man's obsession, programmed from his masters in the future who sent him back here, right? This one man's obsession to get rid of this power. Anyway, so let's play, I'm going to play 2 quick clips now that are basically Jim Chalmers' worst nightmare. And this is not, I'm not playing these clips to praise Angus Taylor, but most of the time people are familiar with, when you deal with politicians, they are the definition of unequivocal. They never want to give a straight answer. So you're going to see 2 statements from Angus Taylor that are as unequivocal as it gets in relation to this bill and this power. Go ahead.
Government Business Order of the Day, number 7, Treasury Laws Amendment, Reserve Bank Reforms Bill 2023, resumption of debate on the second reading.
Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Shadow Treasurer.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, the Coalition will not be supporting this bill.
What would it take for you to reopen negotiations with the government?
Well, there's no potential for that. It's time to move on.
So, Craig, that's unequivocal.
Yep, very clear.
Now, in our alert this week, which we published yesterday, we said, is this the final kill of the monster RBA bill? And I use the Terminator metaphor, or any other horror movie, scary movie you can think of. We all know when we watch a scary movie that if there's a monster or an alien or a robot or whatever, at the end of the movie, the goodie kills it. But every viewer knows, hang on, it's not really dead. There's going to be one last lunge, one last lurch, one last jump scare.
They see a flicker of something.
Yeah. Right, and then it's usually the love interest of the hero kills it the last time, right? You know, blows the head off or whatever. So that's why we say we put a question mark. Is this the final kill of the monster RBA bill? And we put a question mark. As of today, we're happy to say that question mark should be in pencil, so it can be rubbed out, because it really does look like we have, based on what Angus Taylor has said there, this is dead, right? And so we'll definitely update you more on this next week to confirm one way or the other. But I'm really close to saying, look, this is it. The final credits are rolling in this script, right? And again, we did it. This is something the Citizens Party and its supporters around Australia achieved. We saved one of the most important powers that has ever been enacted in the history of this country. We've saved it. Now we've just got to make them use it. All right, now, so that's to stop them doing something bad that would just enshrine technocratic bankers, dictators over Australia. We need to be thinking in terms of what do we do with the banking power that can actually serve the Australian people, and that, of course, is create a people's bank. Now, we actually have, Craig, if we were the government, we would just use the Reserve Bank as the people's bank. It was spun off from the People's Bank anyway. So we created the Commonwealth Bank in 1912. In 1959, Menzies spun the Reserve Bank off it, but there was still the Commonwealth Bank. In 1996, Costello completed the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank that Keating started, and so that's been gone now as a public option. But the Reserve Bank stayed public. It's still a public bank, and we could just use it. If you look at the powers of the Reserve Bank, it is a bank. The Reserve Bank could call you tomorrow and give you a loan if they wanted to. There is no restrictions on their banking power. They can function as a proper national bank.
And they could immediately go into post offices and set up the retail retail arm.
That's what we could do. That's what we could do. But we've got to think, what can we get this government to do? And that's why the campaign for a post office bank as a standalone thing is so important, and we're so excited that we now know the government is in discussion with Australia Post about this. And again, that is thanks to us. So when I was in Canberra for Monday and Tuesday, pretty much everyone I met with was, what do you know about what's being discussed? And frankly, nobody knew. But all the inquiries I've made, those people I was talking to, including in the Labor Party rank and file, backbenchers, etc., they're now making inquiries to see if they can find out what's actually being discussed. Because we need to make sure that what they come up with is the best possible bank for Australia. And to that end, we want to play a couple of other clips now. And this is from two speeches this week by Senator Malcolm Roberts. And it just so happens, Craig, the first speech we'll play is a speech that I had input into, where he's talking about the news of the Post Bank being discussed. And then we'll come back, but then the second speech is something that he quotes from a paper you wrote, which is very good. We're very happy that the work of the Citizens Party is actually influencing what's happening in the chamber. So go ahead and play Malcolm Roberts' speech from yesterday about the Postal Bank.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you. The Australian newspaper reported on the 29th of August that, quote, a government-owned bank created out of Australia Post is understood to be back on the Labor government's agenda, which is seen as a response to the closure of numerous bank branches in regional Australia. End of quote. I hope this report is well-founded, and if it is, I applaud the government for this welcome development. Years of regulation have failed to force the banks to behave with honesty, decency and compassion. More regulation is not the answer. Big banks will always have better lawyers than has the government. The answer is a people's bank offering competition to the Big Four bank oligopoly, or more accurately, cartel. As someone who participated in the inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia, I attest there's a desperate need for a public bank to revolutionise Australia's banking system, the way the original Commonwealth Bank did, and that the Fisher Labor government established in 1912. Today, the Big Four cartel controls 80% of the market and dominates banking. They're acting together to remove face-to-face banking, which doesn't stop customers from needing face-to-face services. It just forces customers to travel further. And not just in the regions. It's as difficult for the elderly in the city to travel to the next suburb for their banking as a regional customer to travel to the next town. We saw numerous instances of the bank's dishonesty when closing branches, and we're seeing it again right now with ANZ's closure of its Katoomba branch. The ANZ treated Katoomba as a regional branch until it promised to not close the regional branches as a condition of its merger with Suncorp Bank. Lo and behold, suddenly ANZ claims Katoomba is not a regional branch, so it's proceeding to close it. The Big Four have concentrated close to 70% of their lending into residential and investor mortgages, with more money fuelling the increase in house prices while neglecting the small business lending and regional communities. All four are aggressively pushing customers away from cash and into digital banking and transacting so they can surveil and harvest your data and collect fees on all non-cash transactions. They now gouge Australians more than $4 billion per year in transaction fees and surcharges. In short, the Big Four serve only themselves and use their oligopoly power over a captive market to exploit their customers. There's a dire need for a public bank that can set standards of service and break up the banking cartel. A post office bank is the perfect way to do it, operating under a modified banking code of practice to restore protections to customers that successive Liberal national governments have removed. Guaranteeing cash and banking services, face-to-face banking in a branch, best interests of the customer and protections against politicisation of banking. The Commonwealth Bank originally started in post offices in 1912, from which it provided banking services to all parts of Australia, even remote areas. It raised loans for the government at 1/10 the cost of the private banks. In the panic of 1914, it protected deposits in all the banks. It supported Australia's agricultural production in World War I and funded the emergency purchase of a fleet of ships in the war, which became Australia's first national shipping line. It made development loans to local councils all across Australia for crucial infrastructure, and it made affordable housing loans to returned soldiers. It accomplished all of this in its first decade before its political enemies reduced its ability to compete with the private banks. Until later, another Labor government unleashed it again in World War II. Public and post banks are very successful around the world. The Japan Post Bank is one of the world's biggest banks and was the secret to Japan's post-war economic miracle, funding the government's investments in infrastructure and industries. France's Post Bank, La Banque Postale, started in 2006 and is already Europe's 18th biggest bank and the biggest lender to local councils in France. Kiwi Bank started as a post bank in 2002, quickly growing into New Zealand's 5th largest bank and the only bank that can compete with New Zealand's Big Four banks that Australia's Big Four banks own. Its first achievement was injecting competition which stopped all branch closures in New Zealand for 7 years. In the global financial crisis, Kiwi Bank was the only bank to increase lending while the private banks all reduced lending. And listen to this, the Bank of North Dakota, not a postal bank, a brilliant state-owned bank, for more than a century it supported North Dakota's public finances and its farmers, making a profit in every year of operation. In the 2008 financial crisis, North Dakota was the only United States state to stay out of crisis. I applaud the news that the government is in talks with Australia Post on this solution, and I urge the government to have the vision to create a powerful bank that can once again serve the people of Australia.
Well,
and this is, he was really excited. He wanted to make that speech because when we were talking about what a bank can do, like this is the thing, you see that list of banks around the world that he went through, right? There is, if our government has vision, they could come up with something really powerful.
yeah, and look, Malcolm obviously believes he's thoroughly committed to a people's bank. He's passionate about it. He sees the from the interventions into the inquiries into regional branch closures. Ever since day one, he's said, "Look, what about a postal bank? What about a postal bank?"
We'll put up his tweet.
through.
Actually, now you've said that, we'll put up his tweet that he put out on Monday about this because I went to his office and he wanted to take a photo because I did say I went to him and said, "Thank you, Senator, for your role in the inquiry." There were 13 hearings. He wasn't able to attend all of them. But he was there at the first one and the important ones throughout. And from the very first time he opened his mouth on the very first day of the very first hearing, it was, we need a postal bank. He asked every witness, do you support a postal bank? And he helped set the tone as a participating senator for that in the inquiry.
You see, what Malcolm's responding to is an entire body of knowledge relating to what we call the American system of political economy. People shouldn't get all hung up about America, because America right now is not the America that we understand from history.
We just mean that because that's what it was called in the early 1800s.
That's correct.
When just after it was sort of devised by Alexander Hamilton.
So there's a whole body of economics that goes to the idea of supporting the general welfare, the common good of the people, bringing these powers of large...
Fostering industry, building infrastructure.
Bringing powers of large corporations under control.
Yep.
That's called the American system of political economy, and the Citizens Party represents that body of knowledge. So when I wrote my article and you wrote a similar article at the same time, we just brought this to light. But see, it's so stark now, Robbie, after nearly 50 years, all we've had is this neoliberal economic garbage, which is just a rehash of the old doctrine of the Liberal Party of the 18th and 19th centuries, the free trade dogma.
Well, hold that thought because I want to play that clip now where he references what you wrote. They called it the American system in contrast to British liberalism, which you've just referenced. Specifically, the economic theories that were being paid for by the British East India Company, right, which was the biggest monopoly in world history. And thanks to people like Alexander Hamilton and the creation of National Bank and this idea that governments could use a national bank to invest in industry, it actually, from that moment on, it created a different current in economics, and the British Liberals were always opposed to it, right? So what's really good about the clip we're about to play is Malcolm's going to quote a paper that you presented in 2015 called The Australian Precedents of the Hamiltonian Credit System, but he's specifically going to be talking about a paper that the Prime Minister of Australia in the early 1970s, John Gorton, the Liberal Prime Minister, presented to the Cabinet about the need to invest what we could gain in Australia if we had a financial institution that could invest in value-adding industries. So run that clip.
And think about productivity, which is the key to wealth creation. I'm going to read some figures here. from the Australian it's from a paper entitled The Australian Precedents for a Hamiltonian Credit System. Page 15, a paper presented to Cabinets calculated the value difference, the value added, in exporting aluminium ore, bauxite, versus processed aluminium in 1970 dollars. I'll convert to 2022 dollars. Exporting 1 million tonnes of bauxite, the raw material, earned $65 million. Processed one step into alumina, earned $355 million, 5.5 times as much for Australians. Processed again into aluminium, earned $1.6 billion, 25 times the cost of the price of the ore, the value of the ore. Processed finally into aluminium products, it earned $7.8 billion. That's 120 times. You can see that the wealth has been created. Instead of just mining red dirt on Weipa, on Western Australia and other places in the country, and shipping it overseas, if we process it here, we can generate enormous wealth, almost $8 billion worth of wealth instead of 65 million.
And there you go. That's if you could invest in that, the sky's the limit.
So we're getting to the point, Robbie, and I've said this at our forums, 50 years of nothing but neoliberalism. There is an alternative, and later in November we're going to be holding our national policy conference, a national conference for our policy release of our party. And the subject of that is return government to the people. Because what people have to realise is that there is a completely different approach possible with policy. And we can go back to that.
That's the trick. Go back to it, because we had it.
We had it. It worked. All the precedents are there for it to work. So what Malcolm's reacting to is, oh, I didn't know this could exist. And we're just simply elaborating what's already part of our history, which is very, very rich. We're one of the few countries in the world that actually had a national bank in our history, like the Commonwealth Bank. And the Americans had two of them. They lost them both. And that's the solution to dealing with a lot of the issues that we have to deal with, including the issue of foreign policy, believe it or not.
Exactly. Which, that's a good segue, Craig, because I think we'll go to the next part of our show, because that's what we're going to be talking about, foreign policy. And it is all one parcel of the same picture. If you just said about our platform for the election about returning government to the people, another way I summarise it is I tell people, look, we're focused on two things: economic sovereignty, which means the people's elected representatives must have control over the power of the financial system, right, through ultimate say over the Reserve Bank, etc. That's without it, you don't have sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and national sovereignty. Actually, just being in charge of our own foreign policy as a country, because the consequences of not being that is getting really, really terrifying. So, on that note, Brisbane is now a great big nuclear target. But hold that thought, because I want to talk about something else just before we get into the meat and potato of that. First of all, there's a real crisis. There's a global crackdown, Craig, happening right now by the so-called democracies. You know how there's the moral superior democracies versus the Morrison called them the autocracies or the authoritarian states. So we're the wonderfully moral democracies, and when we murder millions of people, that's good. That's for a good purpose. And we are morally superior to those authoritarian states who, when they go to war, then they're pure evil, right? But the democracies, we have values. We believe in certain values. And those values include free speech and a free press, etc.
Rule of law, Robbie.
The rule of law. Well, now the rules, it's not even the rule of law anymore, it's the rules-based order. The rule of rules, the rules-based order. Yeah. So then people should be very concerned about this global crackdown that our so-called democracies are engaged in against actual press who expose the kind of information that we expose, that we have consistently exposed on this show for over a decade. So here's the list. Just in the last month or so, very famously, probably the most prominent one of these is Scott Ritter. So Scott Ritter was the weapons inspector who knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. He's American, and he was Cassandra at the time. Cassandra was the character in Greek mythology who could warn of the future, but nobody could hear her.
I think
right?
he was a major or an officer in the...
He was an officer in the US military,
yeah.
right? But he knew Saddam, he had done all the weapons inspecting. He knew Saddam didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, but of course he was ignored. And from that experience, Scott Ritter has become an extreme critic of the US government, the Anglo-American neoconservative agenda. So what's just happened is he got raided by the FBI. They took a whole bunch of documentation, etc., from his house. There was a massive raid on him. The raid confirmed he'd actually been under direct surveillance, you know, phone taps and stuff, for 18 months leading up to the raid. One of the motivations, of course, is in this current period. He's been very critical of America's driving its proxy war against Russia using Ukraine, and he's been incredibly critical of Israel's US-backed genocide against Gaza. As part of the raid, Craig, they actually the FBI stole his records that he had legitimately. These would have been classified once upon a time, but he had them legitimately. His records from when he was a weapons inspector in Iraq, including, it's mind-blowing that they did this, but this shows you what the sort of thing they're afraid of. One of the things they stole was he had a UN report, and the UN, when I say the UN report, the UN Mission on Disarmament report, on the August 1995 debriefing of Saddam Hussein's son-in-law after he defected from Iraq. So August 1995, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamal, defected from Iraq, and he was debriefed by the US government. In that debriefing, this is what the document said. He, quote, stated that under his orders, all weapons of mass destruction had been destroyed by Iraq in the summer of 1991, Scott Ritter reported. So the debriefing was in 1995, and he said the weapons had been destroyed in 1991. In 2002, Vice President Dick Cheney claimed that, in a speech, he said that Hussein Kamal confirmed that Iraq, quote, has resumed its efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. And so, because he had the document, Ritter was able to bring it to CNN and show them that Dick Cheney, the vice president, was lying his head off, right? Because they lied to get us into that war. So that's the sort of stuff that Ritter had in his house, and now the FBI's taken the whole thing, right? These people are trying to cover their tracks as the perpetrators of the war danger that we're in today, right? It's not Russia and China that are provoking this. They are reacting to these people that don't care how many wars they start. So that was Scott Ritter. Then a little while later, a gentleman named Dmitry Simes, who was Soviet-born but an American citizen, and actually for some, this is a bit bizarre to me in a sense, like, curious. He actually got involved with Richard Nixon as an ex-president before Nixon died, and so he was the inaugural head of Nixon's Center for Peace and Freedom. But to get that role shows you this guy, even though he had a Soviet birth, he was very much part of the American establishment, right? He's not just some fringe guy. He also had a role advising the Trump administration, the first time, right? So he got raided. Now he was out of the country, but his house got raided under the sanctions laws that had been passed against Russia, and so now they're making it so that he clearly will not be able to go back to his country because America is his country. So that's Dmitry Simes. Tulsi Gabbard is someone that many viewers might recognise her name. She was a former US Congresswoman. She's now part of the Trump campaign, but that's just because, eventually in American politics you're forced into one or the other. right, Democratic or Republican, well, that's how many people see it. She first became prominent as an ex-Iraq war vet, questioning the continuation of the Iraq war crime in countries like Libya and Syria. And she even defied US establishment opinion to go to Syria, meet President Assad, etc. back in the day. And it's a very, very brave woman being prepared to do that kind of thing. So she got placed on a domestic terrorism list relating to flying on aeroplanes, where now every time she flies, unbeknownst to, she now knows, but till she found out she was on this list, unbeknownst to her, every time she flew anywhere, there was like 5 or 6 undercover police always flying with her, armed, to keep an eye on her, right, in case she was a terrorist on an aeroplane. Right? This is the great land of the free, home of the brave, America. And then on the 15th of August, there was a British journalist arrested in Heathrow named Richard Medhurst. He was held under the United Kingdom Terrorism Act for his coverage of Hezbollah and Hamas in relation to what's going on in Gaza. So these are people doing their jobs as journalists and getting actually arrested for it. So he was held for 24 hours under the Terrorism Act before he was released on restrictions. Really shockingly, about 2 weeks later, there was another British journalist named Sarah Wilkinson. She got, not only was she raided and arrested, she was really roughed up in this raid on her in the UK by the British authorities, again for what she was posting about Gaza. And they even smashed the urn holding one of her parents' ashes on the ground as part of this raid. So that's Sarah Wilkinson. And then the last one I want to mention is here in Australia, our own Mary Kostakidis. Mary Kostakidis is she's a friend of mine. She's the former anchor of SBS. If you remember back in the day when we only had 5 TV channels, and if you wanted really serious international news, you tuned into SBS. And who read the news? Mary Kostakidis. She's now been brought up under the Racial Vilification Act for her coverage of Gaza that she's been posting on places like Twitter, or X now. And the complaint has been made against her by the Zionist Federation of Australia and the head of that organisation, Jeremy Liebler. And they're called the Zionist Federation of Australia, Craig, because they represent the Israeli government. This is agents of a foreign power targeting an Australian journalist, right, for her reporting of that conflict over there.
Yeah, Mary did a very, very, very good interview, which I watched. It was about 90 minutes long, with Scott Ritter on Ask the Inspector. I think you can find it on Twitch TV. We can put the link up. It's worth watching because Mary goes through in detail what she's actually been targeted for, why, who's doing it, and where it stands right now. So if people want to watch that, I think they'll find. I mean, Scott Ritter didn't really know Mary Kostakidis, but the funny part about that, she was watching his show all the time, and he knew who she was, but they'd never talked. So it was a fascinating dialogue between two people that stand for exposing this neocon war operation.
An interesting, Craig, bit of trivia for the viewers: when this Racial Vilification Act was legislated in Australia more than 20 years ago, organisations like the Zionist Federation of Australia said, at the time explicitly, promoting the act, they said this act should be used against our party. Yeah. This should be used to shut down the Citizens Party, or the CSC as we were called then. And that's of course why we actually fought very hard to stop this act, especially when we're told we're clearly seeing that we're the target of it. Now, it's never actually been used against us because, unlike what they claim, we're not anti-Semitic. We don't do we don't do anything like that. But now there's so much of a shift in public opinion against what Israel's doing in Gaza. Their proxy fronts in Australia, like the Zionist Federation, are actually trying to resort to these legal powers to shut down the discussion. Right, and I think they've gone after Mary because she's a tall poppy, right? And they're hoping by taking her on, they can scare everyone else into being quiet. And I don't think it's going to work.
Well, also, Robbie, you have a nexus between the neoliberal economic policies, which are destroying people, like you've seen with the housing interest rate rises, and this rules-based order It's the same thing. It's just two sides of the same coin. We have the rule-based orders and this democratisation program that you've referenced, destroying countries through genocidal wars, and the flip side is these neoliberal policies that are destroying countries through these policies that are destroying people's livelihoods.
And the other point I want to make about these journos is they are, like I said, they've been exposing what we've been exposing for over 10 years on this show. And essentially it's this neocon agenda to project Anglo-American power all over the globe and provoke war against any possible rival. I mean, and there's only two really, right? Russia and China. And that is what's driving the conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and of course the war they want to get started over Taiwan. And that brings us to Brisbane, because Australia has completely bought into this as well. And the latest news, the reason we're saying Brisbane is a nuclear target is because United States B-2 stealth bombers, which are strategic bombers, and strategic means nuclear armed bombers. They have nuclear weapons on them. They are now on rotation at the RAAF base, Amberley, outside of Brisbane. Now, they're nuclear armed, just like the B-52s that are stationed in Darwin. And those B-52s have been only there in the last few years. And when the B-52s, which are also nuclear armed, but what the US government says, they don't say they're nuclear armed, they say they're nuclear capable, right? And I'll explain why they're saying that. When they first were stationed there in Darwin, this raised a real big problem because Australia has a treaty that we are part of with our Pacific neighbours. And that treaty is that we will never allow nuclear weapons in our region. No nuclear weapons are allowed in our region. So this is us, New Zealand and the South Pacific nations are all part of this treaty. So why are we allowing nuclear capable bombers in Darwin and now in Brisbane? Well, because we claim that we don't know if they have nuclear weapons on them or not, and that's enough for us. Penny Wong, in February 2023, she denied this was a breach of the treaty because she said, quote, "The US has a neither confirm nor deny position, which we understand and respect." So these are Schrodinger's nuclear bombers, Craig. You know, Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat alive or dead in the box? We don't know. So our government is happy to take that and say, see, we don't know. So we will just be happy to pretend that they don't have nuclear weapons on them, and therefore pretend that we're in accordance with our treaty obligations. It's not that simple though. Let me just give you a little bit more detail on the bombers though, these B-2 ones that they've only been there for the last few weeks. When they arrived, these are the stealth ones. The B-52s, they are these really big bombers, and those planes are decades and decades old. These are the stealth ones, right? The B-2 bombers. The Defence Department, Australia's Defence Department, said in a statement that, quote, "This deployment provides an opportunity for Australia and the United States," now listen to this language, "to deepen air-to-air integration as part of the enhanced air cooperation." And that's the name of a program, Enhanced Air Cooperation. Air-to-air integration. This is the integration of Australia's military with the United States military. And what began as what they called interoperability, so that we could use their equipment and they could use our equipment, is now interchangeability. We can pretend we're them and they can pretend they're us. And I'm going to interview John Lander on this, our friend John Lander, the former Deputy Ambassador to China and Ambassador to Iran, because the last time he gave a presentation to the Citizens Party a few weeks ago, he made the point that what interchangeability actually means is if there's a war over Taiwan, and we've got all this American military based here, because Australia has identified as the place they're going to run their war from, all they would have to do, because they're now saying interchangeability, is just take the stars and stripes off their shoulders and put on an Australian flag, and all these American military guys can say, we're now Australians, we will go to war, and see legally, by doing that, any war that we have fight over Taiwan, China will not be fighting America directly, it'll be fighting Australia, and therefore they want to do it that way as a proxy so that that avoids an escalation between two nuclear superpowers if they're fighting directly. But they're essentially be fighting Americans who are just fighting under the Australian flag because we're interchangeable. I mean, people should be really, really alarmed at what I'm telling you here. The United States, back to the B-2s, the United States Indo-Pacific Command in a statement proclaimed that the United States strategic bombers can operate in the Indo-Pacific region from a broad array of overseas and continental US locations with great operational resilience. And we are that location, right? That's why they're here. Now, back to what Penny Wong said about America doesn't tell, we don't ask whether they've got nuclear weapons on them. There's a very sinister character in Australian government circles named Mike Pizzullo. We've talked about him a lot on this show lately. Pizzullo was the head of the Defence Department under Peter Dutton, etc. He was the guy who was actually running the government under Morrison, organising who was going to be cabinet ministers, etc. And when those text messages leaked, he had to resign in disgrace. But there's a big operation to rehabilitate his reputation and bring him back because he has, for 25 years, he's been a key guy in pushing Australia towards conflict with China. So one of his virtues, if you will, but it's not really a virtue, it's just that he's so arrogant, he's very blunt about what they're actually doing. He made it clear in an article in the Saturday paper that forget any ambiguity about whether these planes have nuclear weapons. They have nuclear weapons. This is a quote from him. He said, US military aircraft are, quote, not going to come here with anything other than their assigned war load, the load they would take into battle. So Brisbaneites, you have nuclear weapons in your neighbourhood. And what that means is, even if it was still ambiguous, the Russians and the Chinese would have to assume that there's nuclear weapons on them. And so when they've got their big table set out, Craig, and all the map of the world, and the various things that are a threat to them, and so that when they're planning their, in a nuclear strike scenario, what they're going to hit, they now have to take sleepy little Brisbane. I grew up in Brisbane, part of my history, went to Sandgate State School, etc. Lovely part of the world. And there's a big circle around it now, because that is now a target in a nuclear exchange. Brisbane is now a target, thanks to this kind of insanity. But thanks to Mike Pizzullo, they know it's not even based on, they're not even hedging their bets. They know the weapons are there. And this has just happened. We are now gone from people starting to talk about war being some long shot possibility a few years ago to now all the pieces are in place for worst possible unthinkable scenario to happen. And Craig, this is why we need an independent foreign policy desperately.
Absolutely, Robbie. I mean, it's very frightening when you start to think about just how these creeps get into making these sorts of decisions and how pathetic our politicians are. When you look at Paul Keating and what he has to say, we don't agree with Paul Keating on a lot of things. But when he talks about this question of an independent foreign policy, how we have to stand up to the Americans, not just stand up, but basically kick them out, and go back to Gough Whitlam, who wanted to close down Pine Gap, right? Those sorts of ideas are the sorts of ideas that have to be on the table. But it comes
Fraser agreed.
And it comes back to this question of economic sovereignty and versus national sovereignty that you were saying before, because Robbie, without a national bank, without an institution that can stand up and say we are going to protect the Australian people and our economy by directing credit into that economy, we can't tell the largest contributors of capital to our country, which is the United States, to get lost. We just can't do it because it terrifies.
They control the purse strings.
Why do you think Albo bends over so much to the Americans? It's because he knows that they can and they will create an economic disaster for this country if we threaten this particular operation to effectively take us over as a 52nd state of the United States.
And Craig, just quickly in the time we've got left, I will say this, based on my trip to Canberra, we've seen it. It's become more of a phenomenon the last few years. But there are a lot of people in the different levels of bureaucracy and government, etc., who are aware of this, who are extremely concerned. Those people nowadays are tending to find their way to us. They find out about us. They reach out to the Citizens Party. They provide us information. They want to work with us to expose and combat this stuff, right? So I had meetings in Parliament House and I had meetings outside Parliament House when I was in Canberra with these kind of very concerned individuals because nobody, in the building, no one's prepared to really take this on like we are. But we need the Australian people to get behind us, especially we'll be saying more in the very near future about the federal election, etc., and the campaigns we're running, but this is going to be a key platform for us. And anyone, and we don't have to apologise, I think, for agreeing with Paul Keating. The way I put it is this: when your country's at war, genuinely at war, you're on everybody's side in your country. Everybody's on the same side. So there are issues where we're all divided.
Bit like a family argument, right?
That's right. But the really big issues, the bigger the issue, the more we can be united on it. And there's nothing bigger than war. And all Keating does is he just represents an older generation to whom this kind of subservience was unthinkable. Actually unthinkable. And now it's all we've got, except for the Citizens Party.
You can argue amongst your family as much as you like, right? But don't, if someone else tries to argue with your family, well,
that's right.
Those internal arguments sort of melt away.
You're all on the same side.
You're on one family, yeah. It's my family versus yours.
All right, so we're not doing this to terrify people. We're doing this to motivate people. Be aware of how alarming this is and act accordingly and help the Citizens Party get this information to members of Parliament and demand that they put Australia's sovereignty first. On that note, Craig, we're at the end of the show. Yeah. Thanks for joining us again today.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
Thanks to the viewer for tuning in, and tune in next week for more of the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.